I did it in a conventional way for two reasons. One, I kind of like telling stories, I think, and getting chronology, at least in some order, is no bad thing. One damn thing after another, and I think therefore knowing how things unfolded over time is a very important way. It also helps us, I think, illuminate each of the challenges which faced each of the presidents, and putting it in the most simple terms. You could say that for Clinton, between 92 and 2000, who was by any stretch of the imagination, if you mark success as being popular when he left office, and he was therefore a successful president who oversaw 8 years of economic growth. But I kind of put Clinton very much in the debate about globalization. And in some ways, he was extraordinarily successful at selling globalization. But you could say that one of the ways and one of the consequences of his selling of globalization was to leave a whole series of problems behind, as a result of globalization, which began to manifest themselves in the late 90s. But of course, later on, were used as a principal vehicle for Trump to attack the political establishment under the general banner of populism. I also deal with Clinton for the very important reason that he was the first American US president after the end of the Cold War who had to deal with the disintegration of the USSR in the Yeltsin years before the onset of Putin. And again, although he thought at the time he was being highly successful in dealing with Russia, I think the truth of the matter is, and we're seeing that manifested today, and it's another part of the crisis, with not only the rise of Putin, which followed Yeltsin, but also if you like, the radicalization of the Putin presidency since Putin took over in 2000. With the Bush administration, the G.W. Bush administration, clearly the central question is 9/11, the so-called war on terror, the war of choice to go to war in Iraq, and of course, I suppose you might call it the war of choice, the war which is not a war of choice, the Afghanistan war. Now, there was a big debate at the time, and Ken, myself, and others were involved in that when I was still in Aberystwyth. The big debate at the time about the nature of the response to 9/11. There was bound to be a reaction to 9/11. Ken and I think, were at a conference somewhere in mid-Wales when the attack occurred. It was a huge shock. Its long-term consequences, I think, have been not just in terms of dealing with, quote unquote, something called terrorism, but also this segued and morphed into a decision over Afghanistan, which was fairly uncontroversial at the time, although it's become so since, particularly given the disastrous way in which the US finally got out of Afghanistan. But the most important significant one was the decision on Iraq. And again, it seems to me, if we're looking at the onset of what we might call the agony of the American empire, the crisis is not only manifested under Trump in terms of a critique of globalization, which Clinton had promoted so fiercely in the 1990s. The crisis, secondly, is also a crisis of the purposes and use of American power, particularly in Iraq, because that war was so controversial, so contested, did not go through the UN. It raises all sorts of questions about legitimacy and the role of international law. And even today, when Putin is making his justification for, and China too, the justification for supporting Russia in Ukraine, which obviously China is doing, and Russia is obviously actively participating in, given it's the aggressor. Nonetheless, it's quite interesting to see how many people around the world talk about American double standards, and that they've got no right to criticize Russia because of the double standards. And much of this, it says, again, goes back to the decision to go to Iraq and the consequences there, and to some degree also in Afghanistan. You know, that you sow the seeds, but you also reap the crop, and the crop is still coming home with the whole debate today, even about the interventions by the US. And again, it is used in the wider debate today over Russia's actions in Ukraine. I move on quickly then to Obama. And again, each of the presidents confronts the same problems, but Obama's fundamental question wasn't war on terror or intervening in the Middle East, which came to define the Bush presidency, nor, of course, the whole question about globalization, which came really to become the central feature of the Clinton administration. But clearly, what fundamentally confronted Obama more than anything else was the 2008 economic and financial crisis. This huge meltdown on Wall Street, which began in late 2007, manifested itself through a series of closures of big finance companies, and concluded, at least by the end of that year, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September of that particularly momentous year in 2008. Now, the consequences of the financial crash were not only American consequences, they were global consequences. In China, it led to 20 million people being unemployed temporarily, because China then went into a period of huge government spending and intervention on infrastructure. It had a huge impact in Europe. It nearly destroyed Greece as an economy, because the spin-off into the Euro crisis in Greece. But that Euro crisis was also manifest right across Europe, and of course it undermined the American argument that our model of economy, our model of doing economics, is the best. So in a way, it wasn't just an economic meltdown, and it clearly was a great one, with a huge shock and a huge impact, by the way, on Americans' living standards and social mobility and all sorts of other things, and job opportunities, which still runs through the system even to this day. But I think it also, as one of Clinton's earlier advisors, Roger Altman, said, it was a geostrategic setback. And it's quite interesting too, looking at, again, going back to the theme of agony of empire, and what has happened to the United States since it won the Cold War and saw the end of the USSR. I think, again, it was a major factor in undermining the kind of notion that America represented the future. I think this was really very, very significant, because until then, you could say America represented the future. I mean, whatever the problems of the Middle East, whatever the problems to do with globalization, whatever the problems to do with a whole series of other things, including the use of torture in the war on terror, Guantanamo and all that, that had certainly eroded some degree of faith. But the 2008 crisis, I think, reinforced a trend line. And many books started to appear, some of which I reviewed at the time and I'm still talking about today in my lectures here at the LSE, a kind of new declinism set in the academic and policy literature. Almost until then, and certainly through the 1990s, the so-called unipolar moment, do people remember that? In that period, and even under Bush, in the first flush of what appeared to be the first successes of the intervention, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, the general view was that the United States was still on top of the world. And indeed, there was a whole literature which came into being in the late 90s and in the first few years of the G.W. Bush administration, which talked really quite dramatically about an American empire. A new American century was coming towards us, using that term first deployed by Henry Luce, the Time magazine editor, back in 1941. So a lot of people started talking about a new American century. With the crash, with 2008 and all the global and American and economic and political consequences of that, I think, if you like, there was a tilt. There's a huge tilt in perceptions of America, and indeed in America itself and externally. And that in turn led to what we would call a new literature of declinism. And you can simply see the acceleration of publications of books with the word decline in the title. And of course, the great English internationalist historian Paul Kennedy, who had first wrote that book back in 1987 called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, he, in a way, became quite optimistic again that his original thesis about decline of all great powers, including, by the way, that of the United States, in the 1990s, of course, he had been very, very strongly criticized and attacked. Why Paul Kennedy was wrong became almost a kind of minor industry. But now, of course, Paul Kennedy felt himself back, and he wrote a couple of things I remember for Chatham House. Why decline is back on the agenda. And certainly, by the way, in China, and I was teaching there at the time, there was a very interesting debate going on amongst Chinese intellectuals in China. And there was in China a kind of belief that the United States, the era of American dominance was over, that America was already in decline. And I think that may have also changed Chinese perceptions and policies towards the United States. So Obama's main task, and it's often forgotten now, and certainly the Trump 4 years did not want anybody to remember that, but the real objective of Obama, first and foremost, was to make sure that the 2008 crisis did not segue into a 1930s depression. And it's very interesting to read the economic literature of the time, particularly people like the Federal Reserve Chair, Ben Bernanke. He said very clearly, when President Obama formally became president in January of 2009, with the inauguration, his first cabinet meeting brought together all the economic advisors, said, we face a potential 1930s. That's how seriously it was seen. And therefore, Obama had to take most radical economic measures, which had begun under Bush, but really continued. And by the way, I think one of the reasons Obama became president of the United States was precisely because of the financial crash. It's quite interesting, again, if you do polls and pollsters and listen to pollsters, I listen to them sometimes, not all the time, but it's quite interesting. Until about August, the Democrats and the Republicans were running head to head, about equal. The Lehman crash, the disintegration of Lehman Brothers itself, opened up a huge opportunity, which Obama very successfully and skillfully exploited, and became therefore the first African-American president in history. Not an insignificant move, to be sure, given America's race relations history, and something I think people don't talk about enough, to be perfectly honest. And secondly, of course, opened up the possibility of a more radical approach, and not radical in a left-wing sense, but certainly radical in Keynesian terms, of dealing with the crash. And as you saw, very, very quickly, the Fed moved. It was already moving in the last months of Bush, moved very, very radically to lower interest rates virtually to zero. We entered the era of cheap money. Obama actually intervened to save two of the major car industries, Chrysler and GM. There was massive backing for the banks, too big to fail. In fact, you could almost say you were too small to fail. So the banks simply were underwritten by federal taxation, as everybody said, Main Street paid for Wall Street. But it also left a legacy, again, which Trump exploited very brilliantly, actually, and very ruthlessly in his own campaign, that the ordinary guy, the ordinary worker, had been sidelined, if you like, by the crash, that the rich finance guys, many of whom were Democrats, by the way, they're not all Republicans. New York bankers are probably overwhelmingly more Democratic than Republican, insofar as New York is more Democratic than the Republican. Trump really brilliantly exploited that populist argument. You can see it, Why should all the rich guys on Wall Street, well-connected, and also proponents of globalization, who want more trade with China, why did they get away with it? While millions of ordinary Americans, workers, lost their jobs, lost their houses, could no longer afford their mortgages, or could afford to send their children to college, or found it very, very difficult to do so. So again, the deep seeds of the Trump presidency, which does represent, I think, of the real moment of the agony of the American empire and American power, the seeds of Trumpism were again sown, further sown, as a result of the 2008 crisis. There's the two other things I'd like to say briefly, and I'm sorry to go through it chronologically, but that's the way I've dealt with it in the book. So I'm only following what I say in the book. I think the two other things that Obama dealt with, well or badly, and I'll leave it up to others to kind of think about that. Firstly, Obama came at a certain moment of the so-called Arab Spring. And that Arab Spring, as it was then called, certainly not called that now, I suppose, by most people, given what the outcome has been. But I think this segued little by little, and of course, affected Syria with the disastrous consequences, as we know, for Syria. Now, I'm not going to go into all that, but Obama made a very clear statement when there will be there's a red line which shall not be crossed if the Syrian government uses chemical weapons. And for all, as we seem to know, or certainly it's alleged, those weapons were deployed, although some would dispute that. And Obama didn't cross the red line. So there was a kind of an argument that Obama kind of talked the talk but didn't walk the walk, to use a phrase. And this kind of weakened American credibility as a great power. So, decline is not only an objective fact, it can also be about perception. And I think, again, what Trump exploited very well, that under Obama, there was a perception that the United States was no longer deterring, was no longer acting as a great power, and the failure to do anything over Syria. I'm not sure anything could have been done over Syria, but that's my own view. But the failure to act in Syria demonstrated weakness. By demonstrating weakness, this undercut American deterrent power, which is so important for international global stability. That's the kind of argument. Whether or not you buy into that, I'll leave to you to think about. But I think that was an important moment in the history of the Trump presidency. The second and bigger question, I suppose, if you call it a bigger question, was what to do about the shift of power in the world. Because whereas I think G.W. Bush can be seen as a kind of straightforward unipolarist who basically thought America was going to run the world forever and then found out that it couldn't, and it could intervene in country after country and succeed, but in the end failed in both occasions, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was kind of classical hubris on behalf of Bush. It wasn't classic hubristic foreign policy. We've got the power, we can use it, we will always succeed. As Thucydides pointed out in the great history of the Peloponnesian Wars, hubristic great powers who think they can achieve everything in the end burn and crash, as happened to Athens. This is what happened to the United States over the Middle East, in effect, to some degree anyway. I think, however, with Obama, I think he was kind of saying, I'm learning that lesson, and I think we've got to do something different. We've got to adjust to a changing world order. And part of that adjustment was adjustments to both the rise of Russia, the emergence of Russia. The rise of Russia is probably putting it too strongly, but I think you know what I mean. The very reality of Russia. There had been 10 years good economic growth under Putin in the first 10 years. We now can forget that now, it gets lost in the fog of time. But the first 10 years of Putin had reinforced Putin's position. The GDP of Russia more or less doubled. Living standards went up, wages were paid, pensions were paid. So Putin became fairly popular within Russia, and I think Obama probably recognized, well, we've got to deal with this issue, even though it's not going to be very, very easy to do so. And there was that whole moment, what they called the reset with Russia, which again he was much criticized for trying to do. It seemed to me a chance to try and rebuild the relationship with Russia. And there were some very important measures that were taken at the time, but that soon went out the window, of course, very, very rapidly after the Russian intervention in Georgia, and then subsequently, of course, the Russian intervention in what I call the first Ukraine war in 2014. So that particular policy clearly didn't work, although there was an argument to be made on the US side for trying it at least. And I think the second question was really about China. What to do about China. Now, hitherto, the US line on this, and it had been consistent across all presidencies, was that China was a rival, but more importantly, China could become what they called a responsible stakeholder. China could be integrated essentially into the world market economy. And this was the whole point of pushing for China to join the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 2001, which the Americans strongly pushed, by the way. But that went back to Clinton, who was very keen to bring China into the global economy. G.W. Bush followed the same strategy, as indeed did Obama. There was it was a kind of liberal theory of international relations, which has been much promoted by somebody like John Eikenberry at Princeton in his work on liberal internationalism. A liberal order is an order which you can ultimately buy into. It's difficult to get into the club, but once you're in the club, it's very difficult to leave the club. It's kind of putting Eikenberry's argument very, very simply, in a way I don't suppose that John Eikenberry would fully recognize, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. And that really did inform, I think, the policies, of people like Clinton, then Bush, and indeed Obama in his first years in office after 2008. And so Obama did really and seriously think about what this meant. Should you adjust to a rising power? And that, in a way, became the biggest question of all over time, not so much what was happening in the Middle East or even what was happening in the European Union, but also fundamentally, it was about China. And in a way, you could say that while there had been a big debate about China within the United States hitherto, and there had been, right through Clinton, through the Bush period, and Obama really raised it to the very top of the agenda. And I'm not sure they came up with an easy answer to, quote unquote, what to do about China. As liberals, and Obama was one, obviously, he did kind of